of the Indian by Lynne Reid Banks, Chapter 5, From Dangerous Times. With hands that shook, Omri probed into the depths of his chest till he found the box within a box within a box. He eased it out and closed the lid from the chest and put the boxes on top. Reverently, he untied the string on the largest box, opened it, took out the next, and repeated the operation. In the last box, carefully wrapped in cotton, was the plastic group consisting of a brown pony, an Indian brave, and a young Indian woman in a red dress. The brave's left hand was upraised in farewell. His other arm circled the woman's waist and held the rope rein. The woman, her long brown legs hanging on each side of the pony's withers, had her hands buried in its mane. The pony's head was alertly raised, its ears meeting above its forelock, its feet braced. Omri felt himself quivering all over as he stood the tiny figures on his hand and stared at them. "You're coming back," he whispered, as if plastic could hear. But they wouldn't be plastic long. The cupboard was ready. Omri stood the figures not on its shelf, but on its metal floor. Then he took a deep, deep breath, as if he were going to dive into a cold, uncertain sea. He fitted the key into the lock, closed the door, and turned it. Let it work. Let it still work. Let it... He barely had time to think his thoughts before he heard the tiny familiar sound, minute unshod hooves drumming and pawing on metal. Omri let his breath out in a rush. His heart was thumping and his hand shook. His fingers were still around the key. In a second he had turned it back and opened the mirrored door. And there they were. No! No! Omri's fists clenched. There was something terribly wrong. The three figures were there all right. The details of life, which the dull surface plastic blurred, were there again. The shine on the pony's coat, the brilliance of the red dress, the warm sheen of brown living skin, but the pony was right enough. He was prancing and stamping his feet, fretting his head against the rope. As Omri opened the door and the light fell on him, he pricked his ears again and whickered nervously. On his back sat Bright Stars, but she was no longer in front. She sat back, almost on the pony's haunches, and before her, but lying face down across the pony's back, was a limp, motionless form. It was Little Bear. Omri knew it, although he couldn't see his face. His head and arms hung down on one side of the horse, and his legs on the other. His buckskin leggings were caked with earth and blood. Omri, against his will, forcing himself to peer closer, saw to his utter horror where the blood had come from. There were 2 bullet holes, almost too small to see, high up on his back. Omri's mouth was wide open with shock. He looked at Bright Stars. She was holding the pony's rein rope now. Her other hand rested on Little Bear's broad shoulders, as if to steady him and keep him from sliding off the pony's back. Her face was frenzied. She had no tears in her eyes, but they were so round Omri could see the sparks of light in the whites. Her tiny teeth were clenched in a desperate grimace. When she saw Omri, she started like a fawn with fear. But then the fear faded from her face. Her hand left Little Bear's back for a minute and reached itself out toward Omri. It was a gesture of frantic appeal. It said, "Help us!" Clearer than words, but Omri couldn't move or speak. He had no notion how to help. He only knew that if he didn't, if someone didn't, Little Bear would die. Perhaps he was dead already. What could he do? Tommy's medical knowledge was not exactly up to date. How could it be, when he had only been a medical orderly in the First World War? But he was the best idea Omri could come up with. Shocked and numbed as he was, he beckoned Bright Stars forward with one hand, and while she was guiding the pony over the bottom edge of the cupboard, Omri reached back into the smallest box. The plastic figure of the uniformed soldier was at the bottom, complete with his bag with the red cross on it. As soon as the cupboard was empty, the horse and riders clear of the door, Omri slipped Tommy in and closed it again, turning the key forward and back in a second. That was all the magic took. "He'll be all right," he said to Bright Stars, as she sat on the pony, on the top of the chest near his face. "Tommy will fix him." Then he opened the door again eagerly and reached his hand in. The bag was there, and the uniform, neatly folded, with the orderly's cap upside down on top of the pile, and the boots, and the and the puttees and the khaki bandages they wore around their legs and wore, neatly rolled inside the cap. Nothing else. Omri let out a cry. He slammed the cupboard door to shut out the sight of the neat little pile of clothes, empty of their owner, who no longer needed them. He knew instantly. He knew Tommy didn't live to be an old man. That one of those big German shells that he had talked about, those minis, or perhaps some other weapon had struck him down. His snubby, cheerful face, his bravery, and his gentle hands were gone, with so many thousands of others, into the mud of the trenches. Omri had never experienced death at close hand. No one he knew well had ever died. An uncle had jumped the twig, as his father called it, last year. But in Australia, a boy at school had been killed in a car crash, but he wasn't in Omri's class. The realization of Tommy's death, even a whole year after he had last seen him, came as a ghastly shock. He had no one to share this with, and in any case there was no time. Standing at his elbow was the pony, tossing his head as if in impatience, and heedless of anything which delayed attention to his master. Bright Star's enormous eyes were fixed on him, waiting, trusting. Later, he would think about Tommy, and mourn for him later. Who would understand better than Tommy that you have to look after the wounded before mourning the dead? Rubbing his hand across his mouth, Omri looked around helplessly, and then he faced Bright Star's. How many English did she know? During her brief time with him before, he had never spoken directly to her. She had only spoken to Little Bear in their own language. Now he must make her understand. No good, he said slowly. No help. She looked blank, although the shining hope faded a little from her face. To make matters plain, Omri opened the cupboard again and took Tommy's plastic figure, which had come back, replacing the pitiful little pile of his uniform, and stood it before the Indian girl. She slipped it from the pony's back, holding the rope, touched the figure. She seemed to realize at once that there was no help to be looked for there. She turned swiftly back toward Omri. "Help! You!" she said in a clear, silvery voice. Omri felt sheer desperation clamp down in his heart, already heavy with sadness. He followed Bright Star's pointing finger at the lifeless-looking body across the pony. "We must lay him flat," he said at last. It was all he could think of, but it could not be all he could do. He must think, he must think. He watched Bright Star struggling to lift Little Bear's heavy body off the horse. He helped as much as he dared. Terrified, his big clumsy fingers would damage him, but at least he could make his hand into a kind of platform to lower Little Bear to the ground. With his other hand, he pulled his box of tissues toward him and made a makeshift mattress out of several of them. At least they were soft and clean. Soon Little Bear was lying stretched on his stomach. Omri had been through something like this before, when Little Bear had shot the cowboy, Boone. That time, Tommy had been brought in for help. He had had some tiny instruments, dressings, and medicine. Crude as his old-fashioned methods were, they had worked. Omri felt poignantly the absence of an old friend, as one does, not just missing the person, but missing his skills, his role in one's life. For a moment, he felt almost angry with Tommy for being dead, when he was so badly needed. Bright Stars, who was kneeling beside Little Bear, looked up. She said something. It was some Indian word. Omri shook his head. Bright Stars wrung her hands. She pointed to the 2 bullet wounds and said the word again, louder. It must be some special Indian remedy she wanted. For the first time, Omri thought she might be better off where she came from. She knew what to do there. But at least he could clean the wounds. He knew how to do that much. He had some mouthwash, horrible stuff his mother made him gargle when he had a cold. The bottle was on the shelf. He jumped up and fetched it. His head was spinning. He was beginning to realize how insane it had been to start up with this business again. He was remembering the awful sense of responsibility, the anxiety, the unending succession of problems to be solved, but this time he didn't even have Patrick to give him occasional support or a good idea. But Patrick was useless. He didn't even believe anymore. Omri soaked a bit of cotton from the box with disinfectant and handed it to Bright Stars, making swabbing gestures to show her what it was for. She caught on quickly. With light, delicate strokes, she cleaned the blood off Little Bear's back. No more seemed to be coming from the holes. Omri remembered that injured people have to be kept warm, and noticing that Bright Stars was shivering, snatched up one of the gloves he'd worn in school and recklessly cut the fingers off it with some scissors. The Indian was soon inside the woolen finger, which was like a sleeping bag. Omri and Bright Stars looked at each other. "How?" Omri asked. "How did it happen?" Bright Star's face grew hard. "Soldier," she said. "Fight, gun." "In the back?" Omri couldn't help asking. It was hard to imagine anyone as brave as Little Bear getting shot in the back. "Fall horse," she said. "Little Bear lie. Ground. Soldiers shoot." She pointed an imaginary weapon, a rifle or a musket, gestured 1, 2, then waved her hand sharply to show the soldier had run on, leaving Little Bear to die. "You saw this?" She nodded fervently. "Woman see. Soldier come village, braves fight. Soldier make fire in house, kill many, take prisoner. Braves chase. Out far. Bright Stars hide. See Little Bear fall. See soldier." She mimed shooting again. "Bright Stars run. Catch pony. Bring Little Bear home to village. All fire. Dead brave. Woman cry. I shut eyes, not see. Whoosh." She made a strange noise like a rush of wind, opened her eyes, and pointed at Omri with a look of acted surprise. "And suddenly you were here." She nodded. "Spirits bring, you save." Omri gazed at her. He had not the very faintest idea of what to do, and here she was, trusting him. "Don't you think you'd be better at home in the village?" he suggested helplessly. She shook her head violently. "Village all fire. Dead, dead." She pointed everywhere on the ground. "No help. Omri only help Little Bear brother." "Brother? Yes, yes. Little Bear had swapped drops of blood with him." "Brother, yes. Little Bear had swapped drops of blood with him in the last moment, making them blood brothers. He must find a way to help. But how?" At that moment, Little Bear stirred on the ground. Instantly, Bright Stars crouched beside him. Omri, whose eyes had begun to get used to focusing on minute details once again, noticed suddenly that she had become fat. Could it be that... But Little Bear was grooming and muttering. His legs were twitching. Omri forgot about Bright Star's new shape for the moment. "What's he saying?" "Say, Omri, Omri," reported Bright Stars. There was more muttering. Then she said, "Now say, brother." She looked up at him with a look he couldn't bear. He stood up. "Listen," he said hoarsely. "I have to bring help. I need something." He looked at her. "Lend me your moccasins." He pointed at her feet, bewildered but obedient. She bent and took off the soft shoes made of bead-embroidered animal hide and gave them to him. He wrapped them carefully in a twist of paper and put them in his pocket. "Take care of him," he said. "I'll be back." And that's the end of Chapter 5.